No, no, no.
She hadn't said the word mom out loud in 19 years. Not once, not even to herself. Because as far as Renata Cole understood her own life, her mother was a murderer, and murderers didn't get to be called anything gentle. She was 7 years old when the police came. She remembered the red and blue light washing across the living room wall, and her mother screaming her name as two officers pulled her out the front door in handcuffs. She remembered being carried by a neighbor into a car she didn't recognize, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent, while behind her the house she had grown up in filled with strangers wearing gloves and carrying flashlights. She remembered asking, over and over, when her mother was coming home, and she remembered the silence that answered her every single time. Marguerite would remember that night for the rest of her life in fragments, never a complete sequence, always pieces that refused to line up cleanly no matter how many times she tried to arrange them. She remembered going to bed early with a headache. She remembered waking to a sound she couldn't place, something between a door and a floorboard, and lying still in the dark for a long moment deciding whether it was worth getting up to check. She remembered finally rising, walking down the hallway toward the bedroom, and seeing, through the window at the end of the hall, a car she didn't recognize pulling out of the driveway with its headlights off. She remembered opening the bedroom door and finding her husband already gone, the room impossibly quiet in a way rooms aren't supposed to be quiet, and she remembered screaming, and she remembered very little else clearly until the flashing lights arrived, and someone put handcuffs on her wrists while she was still in her nightgown, still barefoot, still asking where her daughter was. Her father, Daniel Cole, had been found in the upstairs bedroom just after midnight. A single stab wound, no forced entry, no sign of struggle beyond the bed itself. The police arrived within the hour. By morning, Marguerite Cole, 31 years old, a schoolteacher with no criminal record and no history of violence, was sitting in an interrogation room being told that the evidence against her was overwhelming. She kept saying the same thing, over and over, to anyone who would listen. She had been asleep. She had woken to a sound. She had found him already gone. Nobody believed her, and within 6 months, facing a public defender carrying 11 other active cases, and a prosecution offering a plea that promised her daughter would at least grow up knowing her mother was alive somewhere, Marguerite pled guilty to second-degree murder. She told her lawyer in a hallway outside the courtroom that she was only doing it so Renata wouldn't have to sit through a trial. She never stopped saying privately that she hadn't done it. Nobody outside that hallway ever heard her say it again. School had never been simple for Renata, not in the way it seemed to be for other children. By the time she was 10, classmates had learned, the way children in small towns always eventually learn, whose daughter she was and what her mother had supposedly done. She remembered a specific afternoon in the 4th grade when a boy at the edge of the playground told a small crowd of other children that Renata's mother was a killer, and that Renata would probably grow up to be one too. She ran home crying that day and refused to explain to Carol why. Years later in high school, she overheard two teachers in a hallway discussing whether it was really appropriate for that Cole girl to be elected to student council given her family history, as though a crime committed before she could even read had already written itself permanently into her own character. She learned over the years to become quiet and unremarkable on purpose, to excel just enough to be respected, but never so visibly that anyone looked too closely at where she came from. Renata was raised by her aunt, a well-meaning but frightened woman named Carol who believed sincerely that the kindest thing she could do for a traumatized 7-year-old was to never mention her mother at all. There were no visits. There were no letters read aloud. There was, for 19 years, a locked box in the attic that Renata was told once as a teenager contained grown-up things, and that she should leave alone. She left it alone. She grew into a careful, watchful young woman who excelled in school, kept few close friends, and gravitated, without ever quite admitting why to herself, toward legal studies. She told people when they asked that she liked the structure of the law, the idea that facts could be weighed and a fair answer could be reached. She never told anyone that some quiet, buried part of her had spent her whole life needing to believe that the system that took her mother away had gotten it right, because the alternative was too heavy to carry. There was one afternoon, when Renata was 14, that she almost broke the silence herself. She had climbed into the attic looking for a winter coat and found the locked box her aunt had warned her about years earlier, its hinges rusted, a small brass padlock holding it shut. She sat with it in her lap for nearly an hour, running her fingers over the lock, before she finally worked up the nerve to ask Carol directly what was inside it. Carol's face had gone pale and rigid in a way Renata had never seen before, and her aunt had said only, in a voice tight with something that sounded less like anger and more like fear, that some doors were locked because opening them helped nobody, least of all a teenage girl who had already survived enough. Renata put the box back exactly where she found it. She never asked again. She told herself, in the years that followed, that Carol had been protecting her, and it would take nearly 2 more decades before she understood that Carol had, in her own frightened way, been protecting herself as well, from a truth she had never once considered might be different from what everyone had agreed to believe. Carol had, in fact, sat through most of the original trial, watching her sister-in-law across a courtroom she never fully understood, and had walked away from those proceedings believing, the way most of the county believed, that the evidence had simply been too much to argue against. She raised Renata with genuine love and a bone-deep terror that the same darkness that had apparently lived inside Marguerite might somehow be waiting inside her niece as well, a fear she never spoke aloud but which shaped, in 100 small ways, how carefully she watched Renata grow up. When Renata finally called her aunt nearly 20 years later to say that new evidence had surfaced and that Marguerite might not have done it after all, Carol went silent on the phone for so long that Renata asked twice if she was still there. When Carol finally spoke, her voice had cracked open completely. "I sat in that courtroom for 6 weeks," she said. "I believed them. I raised you believing them. God forgive me, I never once thought to ask what if they were wrong." By the time she was 26, Renata was a paralegal at Whitfield and Associates, a small general practice firm 2 towns over from where she'd grown up, filing motions, organizing discovery, and building a quiet, competent reputation. Nobody at the firm knew her last name matched a 20-year-old murder case in the county archive, because nobody had reason to look, and Renata had spent her whole life making sure nobody would. She dated occasionally, kept a small apartment with too many books and too few photographs, and called her Aunt Carol every Sunday out of duty rather than warmth. She had built, brick by careful brick, a life with no room in it for the woman who had raised her for the first 7 years, and she had told herself for 19 years that this was simply what healing looked like. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, Renata was asked to help clear out a storage room at the firm that hadn't been organized in over a decade, boxes of old case files from attorneys long retired or deceased, waiting to be sorted for either archiving or shredding. It was tedious, dusty work, and she was 3 hours into it, cross-referencing case numbers against a spreadsheet, when a folder slid off a stack and spilled its contents across the floor. She knelt to gather the papers, and a name on a witness statement stopped her hands completely. Frank Delacroix. The name meant nothing to her, but the case number at the top of the page did. It was her own last name, followed by a year she had spent 19 years trying not to remember. State versus Marguerite Cole. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to sit down on the storage room floor. The statement was dated 3 days after her father's murder. It described a neighbor, Frank Delacroix, telling police that he had seen an unfamiliar car pulling out of the Cole driveway sometime after midnight on the night of the killing, a car that did not belong to anyone in the household. The statement bore an intake stamp and an officer's signature, Detective R. Ashcraft, but no corresponding entry in the trial transcript Renata would later request. It had never been turned over to the defense. It had simply vanished into a box in a storage room 2 towns away from the courthouse, where her mother had pled guilty to a crime that this single page suggested she may not have committed. Renata sat on that floor for nearly 20 minutes before she could make herself stand up. She photographed every page with her phone, careful to preserve the exact order, and returned the folder to precisely where she had found it, telling herself she needed time to think before she did anything that couldn't be undone. She drove home that night without remembering any part of the drive. She did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with the photographs enlarged on her laptop screen, reading the same 4 paragraphs over and over until the sun came up. For the first time in 19 years, she said the word out loud, alone in her apartment, to no one. Mom. It came out smaller than she expected, and it broke something loose in her chest that she had spent 2 decades holding shut. For the following week, Renata told no one what she had found. She went to work as if nothing had changed, filed her motions, answered her phones, and in the evenings drove to the county courthouse archive to request the complete trial transcript for State versus Marguerite Cole. It took 3 days of polite, persistent requests before a records clerk finally located the box in long-term storage. Renata read the entire transcript twice, cover to cover, highlighting every reference to the timeline of the murder. She learned that the prosecution's entire case rested on a narrow window of opportunity, roughly between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, during which no one else was alleged to have been present in or near the house. Frank Delacroix's statement, if it had been introduced, would have shattered that window completely. Someone had made sure the jury never had the chance to hear it. She found something else in the transcript that made her stomach turn. A brief, almost throwaway line from the medical examiner noting that the murder weapon, a kitchen knife from the Cole household, had been tested only for her mother's fingerprints. A natural enough finding given that it was, after all, her own knife from her own kitchen, and had never been tested for any additional prints at all. In 2006, the technology to lift a partial, degraded print from a wiped blade was primitive at best. 20 years later, it was almost routine. Renata began to understand, sitting alone in her apartment at 2 in the morning with hot tea gone cold beside her, that she was looking at a case that had never truly been investigated so much as it had been closed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Inside Millbrook, Marguerite had built the only kind of life the walls allowed her. Small, disciplined, deliberately unremarkable in the way that kept a person safe across 2 decades. She worked in the prison library for most of her sentence, organizing donated books and helping other women study for their GED exams, work that gave her days a shape and her hands something useful to do besides count the time passing. She had made exactly 2 friends she trusted in 20 years, both of them women serving long sentences of their own, and she had learned early on never to speak about her innocence too loudly or too often, because prison had its own unspoken rule that everyone claimed innocence, and repeating it past a certain point only marked a person as either delusional or, worse, still naive enough to expect someone might actually listen. She had written to Renata every year on her birthday for the first decade, letters Carol intercepted and never delivered, believing sincerely that receiving them would only reopen a wound better left closed. Marguerite never knew whether her daughter had simply chosen not to write back, or whether the letters had never arrived at all, and she eventually stopped sending them somewhere around Renata's 17th birthday, telling herself it was easier for both of them this way, though it was a lie she never fully believed even as she told it to herself. She marked each of her daughter's birthdays privately instead, alone in her cell, permitting herself exactly 1 evening a year to grieve openly for the mother she hadn't been allowed to be, before folding the grief back down small enough to survive another 12 months. On a Thursday evening, Renata made the 90-minute drive to Millbrook Women's Correctional Facility for the first time in 19 years. She sat in a visitation room lit by fluorescent light, in a plastic chair bolted to the floor, and watched a guard bring out a woman she barely recognized. Marguerite Cole was 50 now, gray threading through hair that had once been dark, moving with the careful, contained posture of someone who had learned, over 2 decades, to take up as little space as possible. She sat down across from her daughter and did not reach for her hand, because in prison she had learned never to reach first, never to expect anything freely given. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Renata slid the photograph statement across the table and watched her mother's hands begin to shake exactly the way her own had a week earlier. Marguerite read the page 3 times before she could speak. When she finally did, her voice was so quiet the guard nearly missed it. "I told them there was a car. I told Walter, my lawyer. I heard something and I found him, and there was a car pulling away when I looked out the window. He said the prosecutor already had a theory, and it wasn't going to help me to add one more thing nobody could confirm." She looked up at her daughter with an expression Renata had never seen on any face before, something between disbelief and a kind of desperate, fragile hope she was almost afraid to feel. "I told them, Renata. I told everyone. Nobody believed me." Renata reached across the table this time and took her mother's hand in both of hers and said the sentence that had been building inside her for 19 years without her ever knowing it was there. "I believe you now." They talked for the remainder of the visit in careful, halting fragments, two strangers learning the shape of each other again. Marguerite asked about Renata's life in small, hungry questions, what she did for work, whether she was happy, whether Carol had been kind to her. Renata answered honestly and found herself, for the first time, angry not at her mother but at every adult who had decided on her behalf that the truth was something a child couldn't be trusted with. When the guard announced visiting hours were ending, Marguerite gripped her daughter's hand one final time and said only, "Whatever you're thinking about doing, be careful. This town buried this once. It might not want it dug up twice." Renata drove home in silence, and for the first time in 19 years, cried the entire way. The following Monday, Renata approached a former colleague from law school, a defense attorney named Priya Anand who had left corporate litigation 5 years earlier to specialize in wrongful conviction appeals after a case in her own family history had gone unresolved for over a decade. Priya listened to the entire story without interrupting, reviewing the photograph statement twice, her expression tightening with each page. When she finally spoke, she used a term Renata had been almost afraid to hear out loud. "This is a Brady violation, if I'm reading this right. Exculpatory evidence withheld from the defense. If this was buried deliberately, your mother's conviction should never have stood, and someone made a choice that took 20 years of her life." Priya agreed to take the case pro bono on the spot, telling Renata that cases like this were the entire reason she'd left her old firm, and that she had been waiting 5 years for one that mattered this much. She explained, later that same evening, over coffee that neither of them touched, why the work meant so much to her personally. Her own uncle had spent 11 years in prison on a robbery charge before a records error was finally discovered that placed him 2 states away on the night in question, a discovery that came only after a public defender's office had already moved on to 100 other cases, and the family had largely stopped hopping. Priya had been in law school when he was finally released, and she had watched him walk out of a courthouse a changed and diminished man, grateful but hollowed, having lost 11 years he could never get back, and a marriage that hadn't survived the wait. She had built her entire career since then around the belief that the system's failures were rarely accidents, and that somebody somewhere almost always knew the truth long before anyone official was willing to say it out loud. That shared understanding became the foundation of what grew, over the following months, into something closer to friendship than a professional arrangement. Priya worked the case in the evenings and on weekends, unpaid, fitting it around a caseload that already stretched her thin, because she recognized in Marguerite Cole's file the same shape she had spent years learning to identify. A case closed too quickly, a defendant too convenient, a truth too inconvenient for anyone with power to want it found. She told Renata, more than once in those early weeks, that the hardest part of this work wasn't the law itself, which was often straightforward once the right evidence was in hand. The hardest part was the waiting, the years it so often took for people to be willing to admit what they had done, and the fact that for every case like Marguerite, that eventually found its way to the light, there were dozens more still sitting in storage rooms exactly like the one Renata had stumbled into by accident. Priya explained what the road ahead would require. They would need to locate Frank Delacroix, confirm his statement was accurate and unchanged after 20 years, and get him willing to testify again. They would need to identify Detective R. Ashcraft, determine why the statement had never reached the defense, and find out whether it had been an oversight or a deliberate act. They would need to petition for new forensic testing on the murder weapon, using DNA technology that hadn't existed at the time of the original trial. And they would need to do all of this quietly, at first, because if anyone connected to the original prosecution learned an appeal was being built before the evidence was secured, there was every chance crucial witnesses could be pressured. Evidence could disappear entirely this time, or memories could conveniently fail. Renata said she didn't care how long it took or how careful they needed to be. She had already lost 19 years pretending her mother didn't exist. She wasn't losing another one to impatience. Before they ever reached Frank Delacroix's actual name in the file, Renata and Priya spent nearly 2 frustrating weeks chasing a different lead entirely, a reference in the original police log to a D. Ellery, who had apparently called the station the same week as the murder. They spent days tracking down every Ellery listed in old county directories, eventually locating a Diane Ellery who had, 20 years earlier, lived 3 streets over from the Cole house, only to learn, after driving out to meet her, that her call had concerned an unrelated noise complaint about a barking dog and had nothing whatsoever to do with the murder. Renata sat in the car afterward, deflated, wondering aloud whether they were chasing shadows in a case that might simply have no answer left to find. Priya reminded her, gently, that dead ends were not failures in this kind of work. They were simply the ordinary texture of it, and that every wrongful conviction case she had ever helped resolve had included at least a few weeks that felt exactly like this one. It was only after that dead end that Priya, reviewing the intake log line by line a second time, noticed the entry for Frank Delacroix sitting just 3 lines below the one for Diane Ellery, a name that had been so easy to overlook the first time through that Renata felt almost sick realizing how close they had come to missing it entirely. She would say, months later, that this was the moment she first understood how fragile the entire case truly was, how easily an entire life could remain buried simply because nobody happened to read the right line on the right page in the right order. It made her all the more determined, once the case was finally resolved, to build something that would keep other families from depending on that kind of luck. Before they ever reached Frank Delacroix, Priya insisted on tracking down Walter Reyes, the public defender who had represented Marguerite at her original trial and had been carrying 11 other cases the same month he negotiated her plea. Walter had retired from public defense work nearly a decade earlier and now taught a night class on criminal procedure at a community college 2 towns over, a career shift he told Priya, when she finally reached him, he had made because he could no longer stomach the caseloads the county kept assigning him. He agreed to meet Renata and Priya in an empty classroom after his final lecture, and when Priya laid out what they had found, Walter Reyes sat very still for a long moment, then put his head in his hands. He told them he had always suspected there was something he'd missed, some thread he hadn't pulled hard enough at the time, but with 11 cases and a filing deadline every single week that year, he had trusted the police report in front of him the way an overworked, underpaid public defender too often has no choice but to do. He remembered Marguerite insisting, in nearly every meeting they had, that there had been a car outside the house that night, and he remembered telling her, not unkindly but not helpfully either, that without a name or a license plate attached to that claim, it wouldn't carry any weight with a jury and might even make her sound as though she were reaching for an alibi. He had never once requested the full police intake log himself, trusting that anything relevant would already be in the file the prosecution had shared with him. "I failed her," he said quietly, to the empty classroom more than to either woman sitting across from him. "Not because I didn't believe her, because I didn't have time to find out if she was telling the truth, and I told myself that was the same thing as her not having the truth to tell." Walter agreed, without hesitation, to submit a sworn statement describing the plea negotiation and confirming that the Delacroix statement had never been part of the discovery materials he received from the prosecution, a detail that would later become one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the withholding had been deliberate rather than accidental. He asked Renata, before they left that night, whether her mother had ever forgiven him. Renata told him honestly that she didn't know, that this was the first conversation about any of it her mother and she had had in 19 years, but that she would ask. When she did, weeks later, sitting across from her mother in the visitation room, Marguerite considered the question for a long moment before answering. "He was drowning too," she said, "just in a different current than mine." It was, Renata would later think, the most generous sentence her mother had spoken since her release. Finding Frank Delacroix took less time than expected. He was 74 now, living alone 2 counties over with a small terrier and a bad hip, in a modest house with a wraparound porch he'd built himself decades earlier. When Priya called ahead and explained who she was, Frank went quiet for a long moment, then said he'd wondered, more than once over the years, whatever happened to that poor Cole woman, because he'd always assumed his statement had been part of whatever the police decided to do with the case. He remembered the night with unsettling clarity, walking his dog past midnight, hearing a car door and an engine, watching a sedan he didn't recognize pull out of the cold driveway and head toward the highway. He remembered calling the police station himself the following morning, giving his account to a young officer over the phone, and assuming, when he never heard back, that it simply hadn't been useful. Sitting on his porch on a gray Saturday afternoon, Frank listened as Priya explained that his statement had, in fact, been recorded and stamped into evidence, and had then simply disappeared, never reaching the defense attorney, never reaching the jury, never once being mentioned in a trial that convicted a woman based entirely on a timeline his own account would have destroyed. Frank went very still. His dog climbed into his lap, and he stroked its ears absently for a long moment before he finally spoke. That poor woman spent 20 years in a cage because somebody didn't want to make one more phone call. He agreed immediately to testify again, and asked only one question before they left his porch that afternoon. Was there anything he could do, right now today, to help move things faster? Priya told him his patience and his memory were the 2 most valuable things he had to offer, and that they would need both in the months ahead. In the 2 decades since Marguerite's trial, Roy Ashcraft had built a quiet, deliberately unremarkable life, one he would later admit had been shaped, without his ever fully nomming it to himself, around staying as far from his old career as possible. He had married, divorced, remarried, and each time a new person got close enough to ask what he used to do for a living, he found himself giving vaguer and vaguer answers, until eventually he simply stopped mentioning police work at all. He kept, in a drawer in his hardware store office that no employee had ever been permitted to open, an old departmental photograph from the year of the Cole case, and more than once over the years he had taken it out, looked at his own younger face in it, and put it back without ever quite deciding what he felt when he did. He would tell Priya, once he finally agreed to talk, that guilt had a way of becoming a kind of low, constant static a person eventually stopped noticing, right up until somebody forced them to listen to it directly again. Tracking down Detective Roy Ashcraft proved considerably harder. He had retired from the force 8 months after Marguerite's trial concluded, moved 3 times in the years since, and appeared to have deliberately distanced himself from his old career, using a version of his middle name rather than his own in most public records. Priya spent nearly 6 weeks working through old department rosters, retirement filings, and a handful of reluctant former colleagues before finally locating him running a small hardware store in a town 2 hours north, going by the name Ray rather than Roy. When she called ahead and explained who she was and why she was calling, he hung up on her twice before finally agreeing, on the third call, to meet in person, on the condition that Renata not be present for the first conversation. Roy Ashcraft arrived at their meeting visibly nervous, folding and unfolding a paper coffee cup, insisting at first that he barely remembered the details of a case from 2 decades earlier, that he'd worked hundreds of cases in his career and couldn't be expected to recall one file among so many. Priya said nothing. She simply set Frank Delacroix's original statement on the table between them, the intake stamp and Roy's own signature clearly visible at the bottom, and asked him to explain, under oath if it came to that, why his signature appeared on a document that had never made it into the case file at all. Roy Ashcraft stared at the page for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, something in his face had changed. The practiced blankness of a man who had spent 20 years not thinking about something finally cracking under the weight of being asked directly. He told her, haltingly at first and then in a rush, that the district attorney's office had leaned on the department hard in the weeks following the murder, that a fast, clean conviction was politically valuable in an election year, and that a witness statement placing an unidentified man's vehicle at the scene would have complicated a narrative everyone above him wanted kept simple. He named the district attorney at the time, a man named Charles Whitmore, who had gone on, in the intervening years, to build a career as a self-styled law and order prosecutor, and who was, as of that very year, running a well-funded campaign for state attorney general, with the Cole case cited repeatedly in his campaign literature as proof of his record putting dangerous people behind bars. Roy said he'd told himself for 20 years that Marguerite was probably guilty anyway, that burying one inconvenient statement hadn't really changed the outcome. Sitting across from Priya, forced to say it out loud for the first time, he admitted he had never actually believed that. He had simply needed to, in order to keep doing his job, and later, in order to sleep. Word of the reopened case reached Renata's workplace before she was ready for it too, when a paralegal from another department recognized the name Cole in a local news brief about a post-conviction petition, and mentioned it, innocently, at a shared lunch table. Renata arrived at work the following Monday to find her supervisor, a senior partner named Douglas Whitfield who had employed her for 6 years without ever asking about her family, waiting quietly at her desk. She braced herself, certain she was about to be let go for a conflict of interest nobody had disclosed, and instead found him simply asking, gently, why she had never told anyone, and whether there was anything the firm could do to support her. She learned, in the weeks that followed, that being known finally, fully, without the careful editing she had practiced her entire adult life, felt less like exposure than she had always feared it would, and more like the strange, uneven relief of finally putting down something she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Priya recorded the conversation in full, with Roy's knowledge and consent, and spent the following month assembling the paperwork for a formal post-conviction relief petition, a process that consumed most of her evenings and every one of her weekends. Renata worked alongside her at a small folding table in Priya's cramped home office, cross-referencing exhibit numbers, organizing sworn statements from Frank Delacroix and Walter Reyes, and drafting timeline charts that laid out, in stark visual terms, exactly how a single missing page had altered the outcome of an entire trial. Priya taught her, over those weeks, the particular discipline required of appellate work, that a judge reviewing a petition like this one would be looking not for outrage but for precision, for a case built so cleanly that denying it would require ignoring the plain language of the record itself. They rewrote the petition's central argument 4 separate times, each version tighter than the last, until Priya finally set down her pen late one night and told Renata it was ready, the strongest post-conviction filing she had built in 5 years of doing this work. Renata asked her, only half joking, whether she was ever afraid of losing a case like this one after investing so much of herself in it. Priya considered the question seriously before answering that she had learned over the years to measure success less by any single outcome and more by whether she had told the fullest, most honest version of the truth she could find. If a court still refused to see it clearly, she said, that failure would belong to the court, not to the truth itself, and certainly not to the two of them for having gone looking for it. The finished filing rested on 3 pillars: the suppressed Delacroix statement, Roy Ashcraft's account of the pressure applied by the district attorney's office, and a formal request for new DNA testing on the original murder weapon. Priya warned Renata that Charles Whitmore, now a powerful and well-connected political figure with a campaign war chest and a reputation to protect, would not simply allow a 20-year-old case central to his public image to be quietly reopened. She was right. Within 2 weeks of the petition being formally filed, sealed though it was supposed to remain during initial review, Frank Delacroix reported an unfamiliar car parked outside his house for 3 consecutive nights, and Roy Ashcraft received a call from a blocked number reminding him, in vague but unmistakable terms, that pensions could be reviewed and old friends could become old enemies if he wasn't careful about what he said and to whom. Renata was terrified the case would collapse before it ever reached a courtroom, that witnesses would recant under pressure, that evidence would vanish a second time the way it had the first. The fear became personal one evening when a man she didn't recognize approached her in the parking lot outside her apartment, standing just close enough to make his intent clear without ever saying anything that could later be quoted as an explicit threat. He told her, in a friendly, almost conversational tone, that reopening old wounds rarely helped anybody, that her mother had already served her time and built whatever peace she could inside those walls, and that stirring up a respected public official's old case, this close to an election, tended to end badly for everyone involved, especially young women just starting out in their careers. He left before she could respond, and Renata sat in her car in that parking lot for over an hour afterward, shaking, before she called Priya. Priya, who had handled intimidation before, calmly documented every incident, including the parking lot encounter, filed for judicial protection of both witnesses and of Renata herself, and used the attempted interference as an exhibit demonstrating consciousness of guilt on the part of anyone connected to the original cover-up. She told Renata. That same night, that fear at this stage of a case like this one was not a sign she was doing something wrong. It was confirmation she was getting close to something somebody very much wanted to stay buried. She reminded Renata of a simple truth that would carry both of them through the months ahead. People only try this hard to silence a story when the story is true. Far from silencing Frank Delacroix, the parked car outside his house only hardened his resolve. He told Priya, the week before the hearing was finally scheduled, that he'd lived 74 years without being afraid of much, and he wasn't about to start now over a phone call meant to scare an old man into silence about a woman who never should have gone to prison in the first place. New DNA testing on the original murder weapon, conducted under strict chain-of-custody protocols established for the appeal, came back 6 weeks later with a result that changed the entire shape of the case. A partial, degraded print recovered from the knife handle, invisible to 2006-era testing, matched a man named Gary Beaumont, a former colleague of Daniel Cole, who had, the investigation would later reveal, been engaged in a secret affair with the victim's coworker, and had visited the Cole house on more than one occasion that the original investigation had never so much as noted, let alone pursued. Gary Beaumont had never been interviewed in 2006. He had never been considered a suspect. He had, in fact, moved out of state within a year of the murder and built an entirely new life, one that the sudden reopening of a 20-year-old case now threatened to unravel completely. In the days before the hearing, as word of the petition spread beyond the courthouse and reporters began calling Priya's office directly, she sat Marguerite and Renata down together to prepare them for what was coming. She warned them that once the hearing began, the case would very likely stop belonging only to them, that reporters would want a story with a villain and a redemption arc clean enough to fit into a headline, and that neither woman should feel obligated to give strangers more of themselves than they were ready to share. She advised Marguerite gently to say as little as possible to any press before the ruling came down, not because she had anything to hide, but because a single misquoted sentence could hand Charles Whitmore's attorneys an excuse to attack her credibility rather than the evidence itself. Marguerite listened carefully and agreed, telling Priya that after 20 years of having her story told by other people, she could manage a few more days of silence if it meant the truth finally got the hearing it deserved. Priya also spent an evening walking Renata through exactly what to expect inside the courtroom itself, warning her that watching her mother's entire life picked apart clinically, exhibit by exhibit, in front of strangers would likely feel different and harder than she expected, even though every piece of testimony was working in their favor. She told Renata it was all right to cry, all right to need to step out into the hallway if it became too much, and that nothing about needing a moment to breathe would make her any less capable of seeing this through to the end. Renata thanked her, then admitted quietly that some small part of her was still afraid that after everything, the judge might simply decide none of it was enough. Priya told her honestly that the fear made sense, that she had felt it before every hearing she'd ever argued, and that the only cure she'd ever found for it was walking into the courtroom anyway. The formal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early autumn, in the same county courthouse where Marguerite Cole had pled guilty 2 decades earlier, and the room was fuller than it had been in years, filled with reporters who had picked up on the case's uncomfortable proximity to a sitting attorney general candidate, along with strangers from the county who remembered the original trial and had followed every development since the petition became public. Marguerite Cole sat at the defense table in a plain gray dress, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her daughter seated directly behind her for the first time in either of their memories inside a courtroom. Priya Anand sat beside her client, calm and precise, a stack of exhibits organized with the meticulous care of 5 years spent waiting for exactly this kind of case. Frank Delacroix testified first, walking the courtroom through the exact sequence of that night 20 years earlier, his memory unwavering under a cross-examination that tried, without success, to suggest his recollection had faded or been influenced. He described the car, the time, the phone call he'd made the very next morning, and when asked by the prosecution's replacement attorney why it had taken him 20 years to come forward, he answered simply that he had come forward 20 years ago, and someone else had decided the courtroom would never hear it. A ripple went through the gallery. The judge called for order, but her expression, watching Frank step down from the stand, had already begun to shift. The prosecution's replacement attorney, a young assistant district attorney who had inherited a case file she clearly had no appetite for defending, attempted a brief cross-examination of Frank Delacroix, suggesting gently that 20 years was a long time for any memory to remain reliable. Frank answered her without hesitation, describing the specific model and color of the car, the sound the engine made pulling away, and the exact spot on the road where he'd stood walking his dog that night. Details he said he had turned over in his mind so many times across 2 decades that they had worn smooth like a stone in his pocket. When she asked whether it was possible he was simply mistaken, he answered evenly that it was possible, but that mistaken or not, he had reported it the very next morning, and someone else had decided the jury would never get the chance to judge for themselves. The young attorney sat down without further questions. Roy Ashcraft testified second. his voice unsteady from the first question, describing under oath the pressure applied by Charles Whitmore's office in the weeks following the murder, the deliberate decision to keep the Delacroix statement out of the case file, and the 20 years he'd spent trying not to think about what that decision had actually cost. Priya walked him carefully through the timeline, forcing him to state plainly, for the record, exactly which conversations had taken place and who had been present for them. When asked directly whether he believed at the time that Marguerite Cole was guilty, he said no, that he had never been certain, and that certainty had never actually been the priority the district attorney's office was pursuing. He added, unprompted, that he had thought about that file more nights than he could count in the years since, and that no amount of telling himself it wasn't his decision to make had ever actually let him sleep easily. Charles Whitmore, seated near the back of the gallery with 2 aides and a visibly tense campaign manager, left the courtroom during a brief recess and did not return for the remainder of the morning session. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had arrived expecting a routine post-conviction hearing found themselves covering what several outlets would later call one of the most consequential wrongful conviction cases the state had seen in a decade, made only more explosive by its direct collision with an active statewide campaign. By the lunch recess, footage of Roy Ashcraft's testimony was already circulating widely, and by the evening, 3 separate news vans were parked outside Charles Whitmore's campaign headquarters, waiting for a statement his staff refused to provide. Inside the courthouse, none of that mattered yet to Marguerite Cole, who sat through both days of testimony with her hands folded and her eyes fixed forward, absorbing, piece by piece, an account of exactly how and why 20 years of her life had been taken from her. The DNA expert testified next, walking the court through the partial print recovered from the murder weapon and its match to Gary Beaumont, whose own attorney had, by that point, already begun quiet negotiations regarding his client's potential exposure in a case he had spent 20 years believing was permanently closed. The judge listened to nearly 6 hours of testimony across that single day, her expression growing steadily more severe, and when the final witness stepped down, she informed both parties that she intended to rule the following morning, an unusually fast timeline that everyone in the courtroom understood as a signal of exactly how she viewed what she had heard. She did not take long to explain her reasoning the next day, standing before a courtroom even fuller than the day before. The judge spoke for nearly 20 minutes without notes, walking through each piece of testimony in careful order: the suppressed statement, the detective's admission of political pressure, the DNA match that pointed toward a man the original investigation had never once considered. She noted, pointedly, that the standard for justice was never meant to bend toward whichever outcome proved most convenient for the people entrusted to pursue it, and that a conviction built by hiding the truth from a jury was not a conviction at all, but a story told in the truth's absence. She described the original prosecution's handling of the case as a profound failure of the system, meant to protect the innocent, cited the deliberate withholding of exculpatory evidence as a clear and serious violation of Marguerite Cole's constitutional rights, and formally vacated the 20-year-old conviction in its entirety. She ordered Marguerite's immediate release, effective that same afternoon, and referred the conduct of the original district attorney's office to the state bar for a formal ethics investigation. When the gavel came down, the gallery erupted into a sound that was not quite applause and not quite weeping, but something suspended uncomfortably between the two. Word of the ruling had spread through the county within hours, and by the time the processing paperwork was finally complete, a crowd considerably larger than anyone at the facility had expected had gathered in the parking lot outside, some of them reporters, some of them strangers who had followed the case in the newspaper for months, and a handful of former students from Marguerite's brief teaching career before her arrest, women in their 30s now who still remembered her as the kind, patient young teacher who had once given up her own lunch period to help them with long division, One of them held a handmade sign that simply read "Welcome home, Mrs. Cole," and it was the first thing Marguerite saw clearly when the doors finally opened. Marguerite Cole walked out of the Millbrook processing facility late that afternoon wearing a plain cotton dress that had been waiting for her in a bag for 20 years. Into daylight she had last felt as a free woman when her daughter was 7 years old. Renata was waiting at the bottom of the steps, and this time, it was Renata who reached first. The two women stood together for a long moment without speaking, while a small crowd of reporters and strangers who had followed the case for months watched a mother and daughter learn in real time how to hold each other again after 2 decades apart. Someone in the crowd began clapping. It spread slowly through the gathering, quiet and uncertain at first, then steadier, until it filled the parking lot entirely. It was not the mocking rhythm Marguerite had learned to fear inside prison walls. It was something closer at last, to an apology the whole town seemed to owe her. The first weeks of Marguerite's freedom were harder, in some ways, than either she or Renata had expected them to be. She had gone into prison in an era of flip phones and dial-up internet, and she came out into a world of smartphones and video calls, and a pace of daily life that left her overwhelmed by simple errands most people no longer thought twice about. Renata took her to a grocery store on her third day of freedom, and Marguerite stood frozen in the cereal aisle for nearly 10 minutes, staring at rows of products that hadn't existed 20 years earlier, before quietly asking her daughter to just choose something, anything, because the sheer number of choices had become, unexpectedly, its own small kind of grief. She flinched at loud noises in ways she hadn't used to. She woke some nights disoriented, momentarily convinced she was still in her cell, reaching out in the dark for walls that weren't there. Renata learned, in those early weeks, to be patient in ways her careful, controlled adult life had never required of her before. She learned that her mother sometimes needed silence more than conversation, that certain questions, however gently asked, could send Marguerite somewhere distant and unreachable for an hour or more, and that healing, for both of them, was not going to arrive as a single triumphant moment, but as a long accumulation of small, ordinary days spent simply being present with each other. A therapist Priya recommended, who specialized in working with the wrongfully convicted, met with Marguerite twice a week in those first months, and slowly, carefully, helped her begin separating the version of herself she had been forced to become inside prison walls from the version she might still be allowed to become outside them. One evening, several weeks after the release, Marguerite finally asked her daughter the question she had been circling for days without quite landing on. She asked whether Renata resented her, not for the murder she hadn't committed, but simply for being gone, for the 19 birthdays and graduations and ordinary Tuesday afternoons she had missed while her daughter grew up without her. Renata sat with the question for a long time before answering honestly that yes, some part of her did and probably always would, not because it was her mother's fault, but because grief and gratitude, she was learning, could occupy the exact same space inside a person without canceling each other out. Marguerite nodded slowly, tears sliding down her face without any attempt to hide them, and said only that she was grateful her daughter trusted her enough now to say something true instead of something comfortable. It was, both women would later agree, the conversation that made the rest of their relationship finally possible. Charles Whitmore held exactly one press conference in the days following the hearing, standing at a podium in front of a noticeably smaller crowd of reporters than his campaign had drawn only weeks earlier. He read a brief, carefully lawyered statement expressing sympathy for Marguerite Cole's ordeal, insisting he had no personal knowledge of any evidence being withheld, and framing the entire matter as the unfortunate result of decisions made by subordinates 2 decades earlier without his direct involvement. Reporters pressed him for nearly 20 minutes afterward, several referencing Roy Ashcraft's sworn testimony naming him directly, and Whitmore's answers grew shorter and more clipped with each question, until his campaign manager finally stepped in and ended the session early. He suspended his campaign 11 days later, in a statement released without a press conference, citing a need to focus on family, language that satisfied almost no one who had followed the case closely. In the weeks that followed, his campaign for state attorney general collapsed almost entirely, as reporters connected his name directly to the buried statement and the pressure applied to Roy Ashcraft, and he was unable to offer any public explanation that satisfied even his own supporters. The state bar's ethics inquiry expanded within a month to include 2 other convictions secured under his office during the same era, both flagged by independent reviewers for strikingly similar patterns of rushed timelines and missing exculpatory evidence. One of them involved a man named Marcus Idowu, convicted at 19 of an armed robbery he had always insisted he didn't commit, whose file, reviewers found, carried an unsettling number of the same fingerprints as Marguerite's, a rushed timeline, an overloaded public defender, and a piece of surveillance footage that had somehow never made it into the official record despite being logged at intake. Marcus, by then in his late 30s, had spent nearly 2 decades in prison, and the review sparked entirely by the attention surrounding Marguerite's exoneration would eventually lead to his own release as well, a fact Marguerite first learned from a newspaper article and carried with her afterward as quiet proof that the truth, once it finally found daylight in one case, had a way of illuminating others standing in the very same shadow. Priya, watching the ethics inquiry expand week by week, told Renata this was the part of the work she had always found hardest to explain to people outside it, that a single buried file rarely stayed buried alone, and that wherever one shortcut had been taken to secure a fast conviction, there were almost always others nearby, made by the same people, under the same pressures, for the same reasons. She said it wasn't cynicism that had kept her doing this work for 5 years without much recognition or reward. It was the opposite, a stubborn, evidence-based hope that for every file like Marguerite's finally opened, there was likely one more sitting in another storage room somewhere, still waiting on someone patient enough to look. Roy Ashcraft, granted limited immunity in exchange for his full cooperation, testified again in the broader inquiry as a cooperating witness rather than a defendant, and though he never fully forgave himself for the years of silence, Marguerite, in a decision that surprised even her own daughter, wrote him a short letter several months after her release. It said only that she understood fear, that she had lived inside it for 20 years herself, and that she hoped he found a way to live with what he'd done that no longer required lying to himself. She never received a reply, but Priya later learned, from a mutual contact, that Roy kept the letter framed on his desk at the hardware store, where it remained for years afterward. Investigators located Gary Beaumont living under his own name in a quiet suburb 3 states away, remarried, with 2 teenage children who had no idea their father had ever lived anywhere near the town where Daniel Cole was killed. When detectives arrived at his door with a warrant, he reportedly went pale and asked only one question before they read him his rights, whether his wife would need to be there for whatever came next. She was, in fact, already standing in the doorway behind him, and would later tell a local reporter that she had known her husband for 15 years and had never once heard him mention the name Daniel Cole, or the town he'd apparently once lived in, or any hint of the life he had quietly walked away from before she met him. She filed for divorce within a month, telling friends she no longer trusted a single memory she had of the man she'd married, and moved with their 2 children to live near her own parents, leaving behind a house Gary Beaumont would never see the inside of again. His attorney would later argue that the 20-year gap made a fair trial nearly impossible, that memories had faded and evidence had degraded, an argument the judge overseeing the case found difficult to accept given that the very delay Beaumont's defense now leaned on had been caused, in significant part, by the original investigation's failure to look at him at all. Gary Beaumont was formally charged the following spring, based on the DNA match, a reconstructed timeline placing him at the Cole house that night, and a motive rooted in the affair he had spent 20 years successfully concealing from everyone in his new life. His trial, unlike Marguerite's, took place under intense public scrutiny, with reporters from 3 different states covering a case that had, by then, become a symbol of exactly how badly a justice system could fail when speed was prioritized over truth. His trial stretched across 11 days, with prosecutors walking the jury through the reconstructed timeline of that night, the DNA match, and testimony from the coworker with whom he had carried on the affair, who described tearfully the panic in his voice the one time she had asked him, years earlier, whether he'd had anything to do with Daniel Cole's death, and how quickly and completely he had changed the subject rather than answering. Beaumont did not testify in his own defense. His attorney argued, until the very end, that the 20-year delay had made a truly fair trial impossible, an argument the jury deliberated on for less than a day before rejecting entirely. He was convicted on the strength of evidence the original investigation had simply never bothered to gather, and sentenced to life in prison, a sentence Marguerite chose not to attend the reading of, telling her daughter only that she had spent enough years of her life inside courtrooms and didn't need to spend one more watching someone else. The story spread far beyond the county in the weeks after Marguerite's release, picked up first by regional papers, and then by national outlets drawn to the collision between a wrongful conviction and a collapsing statewide campaign. Producers from morning talk shows called Priya's office asking for interviews, most of which Marguerite politely declined, telling her daughter she had spent 20 years having her story told by other people, and wasn't in any hurry to hand it over to strangers with cameras so soon after finally getting it back. She agreed to exactly one interview, a quiet, unhurried sit-down with a local reporter who had covered the original trial as a young journalist and had never stopped wondering in the decades since whether the county had gotten it right. That interview, when it aired, drew a response Marguerite hadn't anticipated: letters from strangers across the country, some offering support, a handful offering apology on behalf of systems they themselves had never been part of, and several from other families convinced their own loved ones had been wrongly convicted, each one asking, in some version of the same desperate language, whether Marguerite knew who they could call. Op-eds ran in 3 major newspapers examining what the case revealed about the pressures placed on district attorneys' offices during election cycles, and a national organization focused on wrongful conviction reform cited the case for years afterward as a textbook example of how political incentive could quietly corrupt an investigation long before any single individual ever consciously decided to break the law. Charles Whitmore's former campaign manager, speaking anonymously to one outlet, admitted that internal polling had shown the case was central to his candidate's public image as tough on crime, and that nobody in the campaign had wanted to look too closely at how that reputation had actually been built. Through all of it, Marguerite kept a small, quiet distance from the noise, telling Renata that she had learned, inside prison, how to let other people's opinions of her pass by without needing to catch every single one. Marguerite Cole received a formal state compensation settlement for wrongful imprisonment roughly 18 months after her release, alongside a public apology issued by the county that had prosecuted her, an apology she accepted quietly and without theater, in a short written statement that asked only that no other family ever be made to wait 20 years for the truth again. Not long after the settlement was finalized, Marguerite asked Renata to drive her somewhere she hadn't been in 20 years, the small cemetery on the edge of town where Daniel Cole had been buried the week after his death, a funeral Marguerite had not been permitted to attend from behind bars. She stood at the grave for a long time in silence, reading a headstone she had never seen in person, while Renata waited a few respectful steps behind her. When Marguerite finally spoke, It was not to apologize or to grieve in the way Renata expected, but to say, quietly, that she had spent 20 years unable to properly mourn her husband because the entire world had decided she was responsible for his death, and that grief, denied for that long, didn't disappear, it simply waited. She knelt and cleared away 20 years of overgrown grass from around the base of the stone with her bare hands, and told her husband out loud that the truth had finally caught up to both of them, even if it had taken far too long to arrive. Renata knelt beside her and helped clear the last of the grass in silence, and the two of them stayed at the grave until the sun began to set, saying very little else, needing very little else said. She used a portion of the settlement to establish a small legal aid fund, informally known around the courthouse ever after as the Delacroix Fund, dedicated specifically to re-examining decades-old convictions, where evidence may have been buried, withheld, or simply never properly investigated in the first place. Priya Anand became its first formal director, and the fund's very first case, taken on within months of its founding, involved a woman named Bettina Marsh, convicted 18 years earlier of setting a fire that killed her business partner, based largely on testimony from an arson investigator whose methodology had since been widely discredited by advances in fire science. Priya recognized the shape of it immediately, a conviction built on expert testimony that had felt authoritative at the time and had simply never been questioned since. And she took Bettina's file to Renata one evening with the same quiet urgency Renata remembered feeling the night she first found Frank Delacroix's name. Marguerite, hearing about the case over dinner, asked only one question: whether anyone had gone to see Bettina yet, in person, the way Renata had once come to see her. When Priya admitted they hadn't yet, Marguerite offered, gently but firmly, to be the one who did. She drove out to the same kind of visitation room she had sat in herself for 20 years, on the other side of the glass this time, and told Bettina Marsh, a stranger to her in every way except the one that mattered most, that she understood exactly what it felt like to say the truth over and over into a room full of people who had already decided not to hear it. Bettina wept through most of that first visit, and told Priya afterward that it was the first time in 18 years anyone visiting her had actually believed she might be telling the truth rather than simply performing sympathy. The fund's investigation into her case took nearly 3 years, uncovered 2 additional convictions built on the same discredited arson methodology, and eventually led to Bettina's own release, a moment Marguerite attended in person, standing exactly where Renata had once stood for her, reaching out first this time for someone else's hand. 2 years later, Renata Cole joined her, having left her paralegal position to attend law school at 31 years old, a decision she made official the same week Bettina Marsh walked free. On her first day of orientation, sitting in a lecture hall full of students a decade younger than she was, a professor asked each new student to briefly explain why they had chosen to pursue law. When it came to Renata's turn, she found herself, for the first time in her life, telling the entire truth to a room full of strangers without flinching, that she had spent 19 years believing her mother was a murderer, that a single overlooked page in a storage room had unraveled 2 decades of certainty, and that she intended to spend the rest of her career making sure other families didn't have to rely on accident the way hers had. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with awkwardness and everything to do with attention. She graduated 3 years later near the top of her class, having spent every summer break working directly under Priya at the fund, and her mother sat in the front row at the ceremony, weeping openly in a way she had once believed prison had trained entirely out of her. Priya's own uncle, the man whose 11 lost years had first set her on this path, attended as well, seated beside Marguerite, the two of them meeting for the first time that afternoon and recognizing something instantly in each other that neither needed to explain aloud. When Renata's name was called and she crossed the stage, both of them stood before anyone else in the auditorium did. Frank Delacroix, invited to every hearing the fund pursued in the years that followed, liked to tell people, whenever anyone asked, that it had been the single most important phone call of his life, even if it had taken the system 2 full decades to finally answer it. He passed away peacefully 5 years after Marguerite's release, and both Cole women sat in the front pew at his funeral, at the request of his own family, who told them afterward that Frank had spoken of the case more often, and with more pride, than almost anything else in his long life. Carol, too, found her own way back into the family she had spent 19 years quietly protecting and quietly failing at the same time. It was during one of those early dinners that Marguerite mentioned, without any particular weight in her voice, the birthday letter she had written to Renata for a decade and never received a single reply to. Carol went white, set down her fork, and admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she had received every one of those letters and had never given a single one to Renata, believing at the time she was protecting a grieving child from a mother the whole world had told her was dangerous. The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Renata, more than either of the older women expected, was the one who finally broke it, saying only that she couldn't undo 19 years of not knowing those letters existed, but that she needed to actually read them now, every one, whenever Carol could find them. Carol drove home that same night and searched her attic for nearly 3 hours until she found the box, still sealed, exactly where she had hidden it 2 decades earlier. She attended Marguerite's release, standing at the edge of the crowd rather than at the center of it, uncertain of her welcome, and it was Marguerite herself who crossed the parking lot to embrace her first, telling her later, privately, that she had never once blamed her for believing what the whole world had told her to believe. The three women, mother, daughter, and aunt, began having dinner together on the first Sunday of every month, a ritual none of them named aloud, but all of them protected fiercely on their calendars, as though nomming it might somehow make it fragile enough to break. Walter Reyes retired fully from teaching 2 years after the exoneration, but not before inviting Marguerite to speak to his final class of aspiring public defenders about what it costs a person to be disbelieved by the very system built to protect them. She agreed, on the condition that Walter sit in the front row rather than avoid the room entirely, and at the end of her talk, a young student in the back asked her whether she still trusted the law after everything it had taken from her. Marguerite considered the question for a long moment before answering that she trusted people who were willing to keep looking long after everyone else had decided a case was closed, and that she was looking, in that very room, at a class full of people who might grow into exactly that. Renata graduated at the top of her class, and in the years since has taken on 3 cases of her own through the Delacroix Fund, each one a version, in some smaller way, of the file she had once found spilled across a storage room floor by accident. She keeps on her desk a single photocopied page, worn soft at the corners from handling, the original witness statement from a man named Frank Delacroix, dated 3 days after a murder, 20 years overlooked. She tells the interns who pass through the fund's small office that it isn't there to remind her of anger. It's there to remind her how easily the truth can be buried, and how much a single person, refusing to stop asking questions, can still manage to dig it back up. On the anniversary of her release each year, Marguerite and Renata have dinner together, just the two of them, at a small restaurant neither of them had ever set foot in before that first free autumn. And for the first time since Renata was 7 years old, her mother's name is spoken freely, gently, and without a single trace of shame, at every table the two of them have shared since.